a little bit about Filthy Queens. And as much as I would love to tell you the entire book, I'm going to limit myself to sort of focusing on women in brewing today. And then at the end, if you have any questions about anything, feel free to give me a shout. So we're going to start not in the beginning of our story, but rather in the middle today with a man by the name of Barnaby Rich. Now, Barnaby was an English army captain who served in the colonization of Ulster. And in his twilight years, he decided he was going to move to Dublin and spend the rest of his life there. Now, despite having no qualifications whatsoever on the matter, he decided he was going to write a book about Ireland. And so in 1610, he wrote a book called A New Description of Ireland, um, which was this absolutely horrific accounting of the Irish people. It was very, very biased. He mixed in with accusations of cannibalism and heretical beliefs. He went on a long-winded rant on the alewives of Dublin. And he said, quote, I will speak only of the riffraff, the most filthy queens that are known to be in the country. I mean those housewives that do use the selling of drink in Dublin or elsewhere, commonly called tavern keepers, but indeed filthy and beastly alehouse keepers. I will not meddle with their honesties. They are in all manner of their life and living to be detested and abhorred. So tell us how you really feel, Barnaby. And he really went on with the insults here, but let's pick apart the insults for a little bit. Let's dig a little deeper and see, is he telling the truth here? Is there anything to what he's saying? And let's find out. So Rich tells his readers that the selling of ale is the very marrow of the Commonwealth of Dublin, and that every house in the town and every day of the week it is sold, in every hour of the day, in every minute of the hour. And it's so sellable that the whole profit of Dublin town stands upon alehouses and the selling of ale. So he's telling us that everyone is selling ale. It is so popular and so important to the economy that the entire economy of the city of Dublin is based upon it. And he also tells us that every householder's wife is a brewer. So not only is the entire town based on this selling of ale in the 1600s, but it's the women that are brewing, and it's all these householders' wives that are brewing this ale. Now, he doesn't view these women so favorably, as we can see by calling them filthy queens. And he tells readers that these women are cheating their customers. In fact, they buy malt in Dublin at half the cost it is in London, and then sell the drink in Dublin at 2 times the cost it was in London. So, and he isn't lying here. We do know that malt is in fact cheaper to purchase in Dublin than it is in London. But were the alewives cheating their customers by selling it so high? I'm not so sure. More to the point, Barnaby tells readers that the alewives had sort of a sweet setup that the mayor and his cronies sort of wink at. They look away from, he tells us, because it's sold at twice the amount in London, and though it costs half as much in malt. And so he says that it's not just the bad sort of alewives who are benefiting from this alliance that the mayor and his cronies wink at. It's the aldermen's wives and the rest of women brewers who do so as well. So everyone is engaging in these practices, these shady practices, as he calls them. And in particular, the magistrates of Dublin, he says, again, wink at, these alewives who in particular cheat their English customers. So he gets very angry about this idea that these alewives are cheating their customers, that they are engaging in these shady practices, that they are charging twice as much for ale as it is in London, even though malt is half the cost. He's really upset about this. And he goes on to say that all women can brew or sell ale. It's open to every kind of woman, be she the better or worse sort. And he says that it's a rare thing to find a house in Dublin. This is an ale house in Dublin, um, without a tavern. And then he says, and a tavern without a strumpet. And he refers to these ale houses as nurseries of drunkenness, of all manner of idleness, of whoredom, and many other vile abominations. And they were, in his words, unfit for any man's drinking, but for common drunkards. So he has this very vivid language that he's using to paint this really horrific view of not only the alehouse, but of women. And he's making this sort of assertion that these women are running alehouses, even though they're saying that they are taverns. So in this time period, a tavern would be perhaps a more upscale sort of establishment, a little bit nicer. And he is saying that these women are claiming to be tavern keepers, but they are in fact these filthy and beastly and abominable alehouse keepers. So he has all these really horrific things to say. But women didn't just start brewing when Barnaby decided to notice them. And Barnaby's words don't exist in a vacuum. And so, in order to understand Barnaby and really to see if we can trust him at all, or if we should just dismiss what he's saying, we need to go back. We need to go back centuries. In fact, 1,000 years before Barnaby was even born, back before the English invaded, back before the Vikings arrived, back over 1,000 years to a place called the Church of the Oak. And you might know it by the name of Kildare. And the famous saint to come from there, of course, Saint Brigid. So Saint Brigid was famous for, amongst other things, stealing everything in sight from her household. She had a particular penchant for the five-finger discount, as we shall say, and this annoyed her family to no end, to the point where her father decided that he was going to sell her into slavery because he just could not cope with the stealing anymore. And while he was doing that, he entrusted his very valuable sword to Brigid, which she promptly stole and sold and gave the money to the poor. And the king that he was going to sell her to told her father that because of this, that she was really holy, and so allowed her to join the nunnery and join a monastic community and become the nun that she had always wanted to be. But, in between stealing everything in sight and doing other things like exploding eyeballs, Brigid is absolutely fascinating. I really highly recommend reading a bit about her. She was brewing ale. So the story goes that she had just started her monastic community in the Church of the Oak, or Kildare, and Easter was fast approaching. And she wanted to brew ale for the Easter festivities. And this wasn't particularly normal at the time, but she had decided that this was what she wanted to do. So she and her fellow nuns get together and see what kind of equipment they have. Well, they only have one measure of malt and just one small tub to brew it in. So naturally, the nuns start to panic. This isn't going to cut it for brewing, which incidentally tells us that the nuns knew how to brew. So they knew that this wasn't enough. And she says, don't worry, don't panic, anybody. I have the solution. So she turns to her godly connections, and through that, she was able to turn this one measure of malt into enough ale to serve all the churches around her for Easter. And then later on, when the bishop decided that he wanted more ale, she was able to just miraculously create it. Um, so this is one of Brigid's stories of miraculous brewing, but it certainly isn't the only one. For example, she also turned well water into 3 jugs of ale for her sick foster mother. But I think probably the most famous story of Brigid and brewing is the so-called bathwater beer story. Now, it's gotten a little mixed up in translation because she didn't turn her own bathwater into ale. That's actually not what happened. according to the original source. So what happened was is that Brigid what came across a group of people who were sick with leprosy. And they begged her for some reprieve. And so she saw that they had water prepared for bathing, and that was the water that she turned then into ale. But I think perhaps my favorite Bridget story is St. Bridget's Prayer, which comes much later from her life, because Bridget was lived around 525, according to most sources. That's when she sort of passed away. And but a poem that came much later in the medieval period, is the St. Bridget's Prayer. And this prayer talks about her view of heaven. And Bridget's view of heaven is that it is a giant lake of beer that we all drink for eternity, which sounds fairly nice to me as afterlives go. Now, of course, Saint Bridget was not an anomaly. Whether she is this mythic figure or based on a real nun that existed in this 6th century, it doesn't really matter too much for our purposes, because what it tells us is it tells us the writer and the writers of her stories were familiar with women brewing in monastic communities. And this is supported by archaeological studies. So, for example, Tracy Collins' work on female monastic communities in Ireland, which is absolutely groundbreaking. I highly recommend reading her work. She found that there were brew houses in nunneries, um, many different places, and not even brew houses, but also granaries and things of that nature. So women weren't just brewing in folklore or in saints' lives; they were brewing in monastic communities in real life, which I think is very, very interesting. And of course, this wasn't just limited to Ireland. Women were brewing in monastic communities also in continental Europe. I think one of my favorite stories is the tale of Sister Euphemia and her demons. And so, Sister Euphemia, unfortunately, had been plagued by demons for a long period of her life. She wanted to go into monastic life. She wanted to be a religious person, not live a secular life. But the demons had tried to convince her to get married, to marry a rich man, to marry a rich, handsome man, and she didn't want to do any of that. She wanted to be religious in the religious life. And so they plagued her, they followed her, they attacked her. And so one night she is in her nunnery where she lives, and her best nun friends come to her in the middle of the night. And it's dark in the middle, and she's a little concerned as to why are they here? And then she realizes that something is slightly off, because they're talking to her, but they had taken a vow of silence. So this was just not acceptable. She knew something was up, and they begged her and asked her to come to the basement to drink the ale that the nunnery had. And so she knew that these were the demons. They had found her again. And so she hid under the covers, and that sort of escape method that I think all of us have used at one point in time to hide from things in the closet and the monsters that live under the bed. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work for her that particular time, and she did find herself, attacked by these demons. But it does demonstrate for our purposes that women were brewing in monastic communities, and that this was an expected part of life there, and that Brigid's community was not an exception in Ireland nor in the greater European medieval world. Of course, not only were women brewing, men, of course, were as well. St. Patrick had his famous brewer Meskin, for example. I think uh, we know the Meskin Brewery in Ireland now, actually, which is famous for making these amazing Belgian brews. The St. Patrick's Brewer certainly lives on today in that wonderful brewery. But I think in terms of writings by monks, perhaps my favorite comes from the monk Sedulius, who fleeing the Vikings ends up in the continent, and he writes to his bishop complaining about Belgian ale. And he tells his bishop that the ale was so bad that it should be drowned in the river Styx and forced to endure eternal torments. And I have had personally some bad beers in my life, but I don't think I've ever wished them to be tortured. So it kind of goes to show that we've always sort of had our own personal preferences um, for brewing and our own personal preferences for what we like to drink. So I think that's really interesting. So that all said, of course, brewing for women in monastic communities wasn't the only way that women engaged with alcohol production, nor was brewing only the realm of these monastic women. Women in secular life also played an important role with ale and ale brewing. So women could women could use ale as a way to negotiate power. So, rituals of power, particularly those of higher rank, often involve the use of ale, in particular, the serving of ale as a way to establish rank. So, for example, scholars like Charles Doherty or Michael Einright have argued that women would serve their male counterparts. So, say a queen would serve her husband, the king, and extol or talk about all his amazing qualities, tell, he's this champion. He has fought all these amazing battles. He's done all these wonderful things. And then he drinks first. And then everyone who drinks after him is accepting his role in the hierarchy as the top of the food chain, so it were. And drinking after him, they are accepting their own subordination. And so we see this sort of ritual pan out in folklore and the myth cycle. So, for example, Lugh was the god of sun and light. And in one story called Phantom's Frenzy, he, alongside a woman who is known as the Sovereignty of Ireland, host um, several heroes at their hall. And so what she does, this sovereignty figure, is she asks, look, who are the rulers of Ireland from now until eternity? And so she goes around and serves these people, establishing their right to rule as part of this beer or ale related ritual. And so this was a really important part. So women naming the rulers and serving the drink. And so this was a way in secular society that women would use ale and serve ale as a way to establish these social hierarchies. And of course, this didn't just show up in drinking rituals. Um, I'm sure many of us have rented accommodation at some point. Maybe we still do. I'm sure many of us still do. And you typically pay in euro or dollars or whatever currency it is that where you live. But what if you could pay your rent in beer, glassware, and parties? Well, in medieval Ireland, this was definitely a possibility, particularly for really high-ranking members of society. So, as scholar Charles Doherty explains, gift giving was a critical part of the social fabric in early medieval Ireland. He says this was a way to create ties between kings and subjects. Accepting a gift was accepting the king's superiority, while giving a gift was establishing the king's dominance. So it's sort of like the rituals that we talked about today, but sort of on a much larger scale. So, in return for the gifts, the subject would offer tribute to the king. And so, all of this was to sort of create and maintain alliances. And so, we can see this in works like the Book of Rites, which was written in the 12th century. So, this is where we can see this sort of give and take between kings, and gift exchange, and how this relates to our central topic of ale, and more importantly, women. Well, of course, the kings would owe each other various things, including drinking horns, sometimes vats of ale, sometimes ale festivals or ale feasts. But we also see that certain queens would be owed drinking horns from not only another king, but from another queen, which shows us that queens were also involved in this established drinking, ale, sovereignty, ritual of power in early medieval Ireland, and that this was an important part of these sort of broader rituals. And I think that's particularly fascinating that we see not only these gift exchanges between kings, but also between queens. And so once again, we can see that ale plays a really important role, not only in these rituals of kingship, but also between queens themselves, that they had their own rituals amongst themselves. And I think that's really an important thing to outline when we're talking about early medieval history and the role of women and ale. Not only that, let's talk about maybe something that we can relate to, because I'm sure some of us, most of us aren't probably ruling little fiefdoms. So we want to see something maybe that we can sort of see ourselves in perhaps a bit more. And so for that, I'm going to turn to the Triads of Ireland. And so the Triads of Ireland was written again about 1,000 years ago, and the author tells readers the essential necessities or things that he likes in threes. And so one of these threes are the three essential necessities for a man's household, and they are ale, a bath, and a large fire. And I think anyone who has lived in Ireland and enjoyed a nice cold Irish rain in the middle of the depths of January will probably appreciate a nice hot bath with a lovely beer and a nice warm fire. So I think we can really see ourselves in those aspects. And for that, also the Triads of Ireland talks a lot about feasting and the alehouse and hospitality. And so again, we can see ourselves in that because our author talks about music in the alehouse, storytelling in the alehouse. And so it's not just in our bath beer with our warm fire that we find ourselves in these stories from 1,000 years ago. We can also see ourselves in listening to live music at the pub or enjoying, telling stories amongst ourselves. And I think that's kind of fantastic. Now I want to move along. Um, as we progress in time in early medieval Ireland, I'm sure most of you are familiar that around the 9th century, the Vikings arrive. And with the Vikings, they come with their own cultural traditions. Now, these traditions, in some ways, were very similar to those in Ireland, and in particular, those that related to ale. So this was a wonderful way for both cultures to blend, to acculturate, to understand each other. So we just briefly talked about the rituals of ale service as it relates to this sort of power hierarchy and how women would serve their husbands or their brothers or their fathers as a way of establishing this sort of hierarchical rule, and they would serve the drink while also, talking about the amazing battles that they've won and how strong and amazing and the like. And then again, the people that drank after were acknowledging the first persons to drink's right to rule. And so, as I said, this was also a common thing in the Norse cultures, the Norwegians cultures that would eventually find their way to Ireland. So, one of my favorite stories to illustrate this point is the story of Guthrum, who was married to none other than Attila the Hun. So, She was married to Attila for several years, and her brothers were both incredibly wealthy men. And so Attila invited her brothers to come to his kingdom. Now, Guthrum knew that this was not that he had something afoot. So she wrapped a ring in hair and sent it to her brothers as a warning. Don't come, don't come, don't come. He's up to something. I don't know what it's going to be. And naturally, they ignored her and showed up. And Attila seized them, tied them down, and tried to get the location of their treasure and their wealth from them. And they would not and refused to give it up, and he ended up killing both of her brothers. Now, Guthrun was not particularly pleased with this state of affairs, and so she decided to form her own version of revenge. And to do this, she slaughtered both of his children, and in one version, turned their skulls into ale goblets and served her husband in a twisted version of that ritual that we talked about earlier, the serving ritual. She served her husband her own children's skull cauldrons or skull goblets as a way to seek vengeance against him. And it's a really horrific story, but it does illustrate this sort of importance of the ale ritual, the serving ritual, and how Guthrun's use of this is really a perversion of this understanding of this ale serving social ritual. And it really spoke to the audience at the time about how horrific this really was. And I think we can really understand that. And it is something that would have also been understood by Irish audiences because they would have had this ritual as well. So it's really important to note that not only was this something that was happening in Irish culture, but it was something that was well understood in with from the Viking invaders. And so it's through this that they can speak to each other. And we know that the people that arrived in these Viking invasions were carrying out similar rituals in Ireland. And we know this through the use of grave goods. So, for example, in Ballyholme Bay, there is a set of serving bowls. We have found cauldrons, ladles, buckets, all sorts of serving equipment that women would have used, or people in general would have used to serve ale and part of these rituals. Now, scholars like Jenny Jawkins have argued that in the Scandinavian medieval world, in the Viking Age, that women were probably brewing primarily in households, but of course, we also have evidence for men brewing as well. But one of the solid examples we have within the saga materials of women brewing comes to us from the saga of Half and his heroes. And here we have the story of a king named Alaric and his two wives. So Alaric was already married to a woman named Signy, but he was struck by the beauty of another woman named Gerhild, who he came upon naturally brewing ale. And so he decided that he wanted to marry her too. And as you can imagine, this went over rather poorly with his first wife. So the king, in his wisdom, decided he couldn't be married to both of them because of their squabbles. And so he wanted to have a brewing competition, and whoever made the best ale won him, though I'm not sure that he's quite the prize. So Gerhild, which was the second woman that he came across, treated with Owen, and he spit in her ale, and so she won the contest and won Alaric. Um, and so, if the saga source is to be believed, then we can see that women were brewing in the Viking Age, and with that brought that practice with them to Ireland. And now we turn to finally the English invasion, and we're getting closer to our Barnaby Rich and filthy queens. So the English arrived at the end of the 12th century and brought with them all manner of things. But for our purpose, we're going to talk about. So one of the things they brought with them is this concept of the toll bowl. Now, King John of England, yes, the one famous for the Magna Carta, decided that he wanted to invoke something, as I said, called the toll bull. So, for example, in his 21 April 1201 decree, he stated that the ale brewers of Dublin were to pay to the Abbey of St. Thomas the Martyr a toll of ale and mead. And so specifically, they had to give a gallon and a half of the best ale and mead and much of the second from all of the taverns in Dublin to this massive Abbey of St. Thomas. So again, all of these brewers in Dublin had to provide this ale to this abbey as sort of a tithe. So 200 years later, in 1308, we come across a legal case. And it is very hard often to find women in brewing history in Ireland or indeed everywhere because they don't really appear often until they generally break a law. So in this case, we have that example. So in 1308, Juliana Honeycott, along with four other women, Lucinda Lautrec, Mabilla Arnold, and Elena Dedun, and Joan Tyrrell, and some 20 men, found themselves facing off against the abbot of St. Thomas. And they found themselves in trouble because they hadn't paid their toll bill. And they tried to kind of argue why they didn't. And I'm just going to focus on Juliana. So Juliana argued that because her property was associated with an inn, and inns didn't have to give the ale to St. Thomas, that she was immune. Well, unfortunately for our Juliana, she had to pay the toll bill. She ended up having to pay the toll bill. In fact, all of the people who were in this legal case as defendants ended up having to pay the toll bill. But luckily for her, she didn't end up having to pay any extra fines. But it is in instances like this, in these legal cases, where we can actually see women brewing. And this is apparent in other places within this English now controlled areas of Ireland. So, for example, in Kildare. So Friar Thomas, or Friar Michael, as he is known, we're not entirely sure who he is, but he is the author or stated author of a series of poems from Kildare. So we're, again, I suppose, circling back to our St. Brigid. And these were, again, written around the 1330s, so closer to our Juliana's time, but maybe a little bit 20 years or so after. So one of the poems, as I said, is called Satire. And in Satire, Friar Michael takes aim at basically a whole plethora of medieval occupations: nuns, potters, bakers, tailors, and of course our brewing women. And he says to them, "Hail be you Brewsters with your gallons, bottles, and quarts." And an aside, these are the assigned measures of ale. So ale was supposed to be served in these specific measures. And these are the gallon, the pottle, the quart, and the pint. And these were the legal measures. And so that's what he is talking about. So I shall start again. Hail be to you Brewsters with your gallons, pottles, and quarts all over the town. Your thumbs take much away. Shame has possessed the guile. Be careful of the cucking stool, the lake is deep and dirty. So when the English arrived in and invaded and colonized parts of Ireland, they brought with them these rules, and one of them being this assize of ale. So the legal measures in which you had to sell ale, in the legal measures in which you had to sell ale. So as I said, the bottles, the quarts. Okay. So Friar Michael here is talking about, their thumbs taking much away from these legal measures. So again, he's alluding to this sort of idea that these brewers might be cheating their customers, perhaps. And if they were doing this dishonest behavior, they might want to be careful because they might face the ducking stool. So these fears that women were cheating their customers weren't just found in our Friar Michael's poems in satire. we can find, for example, the chain book of the Dublin Corporation in 1305 had a code that translated that every woman brewer had to pay two shillings yearly unless exempted by the bailiffs. And the fine for making ale inferior to the quality required by that assize was 15 pence. So we can see here that they're enforcing these legal codes, these rules around brewing and the measures of brewing and the quality of ale, what it had to be. And so Friar Michael is sort of reflecting what the legal codes are saying. He's sort of, but also, I guess, sort of poking fun at it, suggesting that maybe quite a few women are cheating their customers regardless of these legal codes. Now, was anyone actually going to face the ducking stool? Because most of these regulations, in fact, just list fines. Because reality is that cheating your customers would kind of be an expected part of business. Not necessarily intentionally. I'm sure some people did liberally cheat their customers because people are people, but most women probably didn't intend to cheat their customers. But having very strict portions and only limited glassware or pottery or whatever you could get your hands on meant that women probably inadvertently did end up cheating their customers. They didn't have the sort of technology we have today to make everything quite as perfect as it was. So a lot of cases we can see just result in fines. But that's not to say that there aren't any instances of some women having to face the ducking stool, so it were. Apparently in Kilkenny, sometime in 1333, the corporation bylaws of Kilkenny argued that if any alewife sells a false measure a third time, so that three strikes and she's out, then she will be subjected to the swingling stool for corporeal punishment. So we do see that there are some examples then of women who might have found themselves in this sort of wrong side of the ducking stool, though I haven't found any cases of women who actually found themselves subjected to that particular torment. Um, in fact, most of the laws, though, in the 14th century and into the 15th century only mention women in brewing. And it's only in the summer of 1481 that we see the laws and ordinances of Dublin even start to mention men in the brewing trade. And this is the Dublin Assembly Rolls addresses the brewing people of the city as brewers and brewsters, firstly marking a clear gender delineation. And in this case, they're instructed not to sell their ale to resellers outside of their home. So again, this sort of clear idea of who should be selling, why they should be selling, what they should be selling, is very, very much structured. But again, women are the ones who are brewing as well, alongside perhaps their husbands or still on their own. So we can see that going on through the 1500s up until we reach again our Barnaby Rich. So our Barnaby Rich, who tells us that every householder's wife is a brewer and that they are all these cheating alewives, these most filthy queens in 1610. However, Barnaby didn't quite get away with his assertions. In fact, he must have had quite a frosty experience living in Dublin after he wrote his new description of Ireland. So frosty, for example, that he had to write a second book called A True and Kind Excuse, written in defense of that book, entitled A New Description of Ireland. And he addressed an apology to the knights, barons, the Lord Deputy of Ireland, and everyone he managed to offend. Now, his apology, this second book, is pretty weak by our modern standards, but he does apologize to the brewing housewives of Dublin. He says to them that he was only talking about the bad sort, not the good sort of women who brewed. He was only talking about those other women, the bad sort, when he was referring to the brewing women of Dublin as most filthy queens. In fact, he backtracks so much that he remarks that brewing belongs to good housewifery and that every wise woman should be undertaking it. So he's really backtracking here, really going for it, really rubbing it in that all of these women should be brewing. This is the domain of the housewife. It's this wonderful thing that women should be doing. And I was only talking about those bad sort of women over here who were brewing and cheating their customers and doing all of those things that he accused them of. He wasn't talking about, the good sort of women. But having read both books, Barnaby was certainly not making that distinction in the first book whatsoever. That is definitely a him trying to dig himself out of a hole here. So he tries to really get out of this hole that he has dug himself into, like I said. And he goes on to say that the women of Dublin are the best of women, and he says, quote, "I speak it from my heart. I've never heard women less infamed or misreported in any city or town whatsoever I have traveled. So if Thucydides' rule be true, that those women are to be accounted most honest, that I are least spoken of, I say the citizens' wives of Dublin may march in equal rank with those women." So he's just really laying it on thick. Quite a far cry from our filthy and beastly alehouse keepers. And in the end, he does try to double down a bit on that some of the women who brew are certainly not the honest sort and that they are cheating their customers. But Barnaby really must have created quite a bind for himself to have to write this second book and this apology for referring to the brewing women of Dublin as most filthy queens. And that is why I've named the book Filthy Queens, because it is not only an insult, but it was something that women pushed back on. And he actually had to apologize for. So I do view it as something to be reclaimed, a phrase that I think he thought he was going to quite get away with, but he ended up getting in quite a bit of trouble for. And so that is why the book is called Filthy Queens. And so thank you so much for coming to my talk today. I really appreciate it and hope you might have any questions.